Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome, welcome. We have people filtering in. We'll give them another few seconds. Good evening. Welcome. So happy you chose to spend the next hour with me. Welcome, welcome, everyone. Delighted you're here. Delighted you're here. Tish, thanks for your message. This is a talk that is near and dear to me. I'll tell you a little personal story as we're waiting for everybody to come in. And oh, I always love it when people tell me where they're from. If you feel comfortable doing that, please do so. Share where you're zooming in from. Joe Birch, thanks for being here tonight. Quick personal story. When I was in grad school in Boston, I thought I wanted to be a PhD in art history, and I was too shy. I didn't feel comfortable speaking in front of people, if you could believe it. So I thought I would get over that shyness by becoming a museum teacher at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. So I did that for several years living in Boston, and it was just a magical experience. So I am going to kick into museum teacher mode tonight. and and just have a lot of fun remembering all these wonderful details about this incredible museum. I love to see where everybody's zooming in from. Um, I know our colleague in Tewksbury is so good at calling everybody out. I'm looking through this list and I'm so happy to see people from near and far. Portland, Oregon. Thanks for being here. Um, Wonderful. Thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your day. I think we have quorum. So again, officially welcome everybody. I'm delighted you're here. I'm honored to have your time and attention for the next hour or so. My name is Jane Oneail, and I own a company, Culturally Curious. I specialize in putting together art appreciation programs like this one. It is an absolute delight to share some of the stories of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum with you this evening. So, as always, I like to start off with a program overview. But before we even get to that, it is important to just emphasize how exceptional Isabella Stewart Gardner was as a woman who not only collected this incredible collection of art and decorative arts and furniture in the 1800s, but had the vision to make a museum. She helped to bring that vision to life and then shared it with the public. She is really singular in this way in the United States. She was an independent woman, and she really got stuff done. There's a lot to respect about that. So let me give you a sense in terms of how we'll spend this hour together. I'm so excited. We'll get started with a quick introduction to Isabella Stewart Gardner so we have a sense in terms of who she was. Then we'll turn our attention to actually building this museum that we all know of as the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. She called it Fenway Court. We'll talk a little bit about that name and its placement in the city of Boston. Then we'll zero in on some of the collection highlights, the treasures, great and small. You can't talk about the museum without talking about the theft. So we'll touch on that briefly as well and then wrap up. So we've been feasting our eyes on this beautiful image of her courtyard, and we will be returning to that along the way. But let's get started with our introduction to Isabella Stewart Gardner. What a beautiful name, right? She was, of course, born Isabella Stewart. She was born in 1840, and I think something that surprises a lot of people about her was that she was a New Yorker. She wasn't originally from Boston. We can see her here on the left, an image of her from about the age of 10 or 12 years old. She came from a very wealthy background, very privileged. She was educated as a young woman. And as a teenager, well, women in those days, they weren't sent off to college. She went to finishing school, essentially. So she went to study French in France, in Paris, and went to a school where they did all of the instruction in French. And so you can imagine that she really bonded with some of the other American girls that were there. We'll get back to some of those connections in just a moment. Just after finishing her studies in French as a teenager, she and her family went on a grand tour of Europe, traveling all around, seeing the important sites and cathedrals and that sort of thing. And just outside of Milan, she and her family visited a museum called the Poldi Pizzoli. This is a painting of that museum from the late 1800s. It's not a painting that she would have seen, but it gives us insight into what the museum looked like, what she saw while she was there. And believe it or not, as a teenager, Isabella Stewart actually said, if I ever have any money of my own, I'd like to make a museum just like this place. So, of course, that is foretelling. Now, after she and her family returned to the United States, she wants to reconnect with some of those girls that she had studied with in Paris. One of them lived in Boston. Her name was Julia Gardner. So Isabella Stewart went up to Boston, met with Julia Gardner, and met her brother, who was Jack Gardner. And we can see Isabella Stewart and Jack Gardner here. Apparently, a lot of hearts in Boston were broken when he set his sights on Isabella Stewart. Now we can see from these images that that Isabella Stewart wasn't necessarily the most beautiful woman in New York or in Boston, but apparently she was vivacious. She was curious about the world. She always had something interesting to say, and she was filled with energy, a real vitality. And Jack Gardner, who was one of the most eligible bachelors in Boston, was really taken by those elements of who she was. So the couple got married just shy of her 20th birthday, so right around 1860. And they were so lucky because his parents gifted them a Beacon Street brownstone. We should all be so lucky, right? The brownstone 152 no longer exists, but there is a building in that place right now. And it was recently on the market for about $13 million. So, not a bad place to call home, especially as you're just launching yourself, right? So, within a few years, the Gardners were lucky enough to welcome a little baby into their family. These are photos of their son, who was named after his father, called Jackie Gardner. And you can see that Isabella Stewart Gardner was a doting mother, sort of nuzzling the back of his head, kind of hiding behind him in this photograph. Now, tragically and consequentially, this little baby did not live actually, he didn't live to the age of 2. And it's a death that profoundly affected Isabella Stewart Gardner. She essentially had to watch her baby be sick and kind of slowly die. And the grief just overcame her. It paralyzed her, understandably, right? And at this time, all of her friends and her husband's relatives who lived nearby, they were all, having babies and their families were growing, and it sort of compounded her grief. So her husband went to her doctor and asked essentially, how do I get my old wife back? And I wish doctors still wrote prescriptions like this today. Apparently, her doctor said, take her to Europe. So that's what they did. They had to apparently strap her to her bed and carry her out of her Beacon Street brownstone that way. They put her in an ambulance and set sail from Boston Harbor for Europe. And it actually did the trick. It got Jack Gardner his old wife back. It gave her a sense of purpose in the world. And so travel became their thing. So from 1860 on, for the next several decades, they made it their mission to see sites all over the planet. They weren't just going to Europe, they were going to Egypt, Cambodia, Japan. Sometimes this very wealthy woman was traveling on the backs of donkeys to get to these remote locations that she wanted to see. And it's kind of cute because they both kept travel diaries, she and her husband, and his is all business. It's like, we spent this amount of money getting here. And then once we got here, we spent a little more. And she kept these wonderful travel diaries, and they are all in the collection of her museum. You can kind of leaf through them virtually on the museum's website. But we have like a little bit of a snippet of her experience in Egypt, where we have this postcard with the Sphinx and the pyramids in the background. We can see that she's kind of trying her hand at hieroglyphics here, and it's just covering up like a little watercolor that she rendered from the experience. And her travel diaries talk about her experience running up to the Great Pyramids of Giza and then throwing herself back in the sand and looking up at that monument. It's so hard to imagine any one of us having an experience like that today, let alone back in the 1800s where you couldn't just jet around the planet. So it gives you a sense in terms of, I don't know, her beautiful kind of intellectual engagement with the world. Now, they love to do all of this traveling, and the last leg of every journey was in her favorite city, which was the city of Venice, Italy. We can see her here hanging out in the back of a gondola, living her best life. And I love this portrait of her over on the left. It's probably the portrait that really sort of encapsulates who she was best. Every time she stayed in Venice, almost every time she stayed in Venice, she stayed at this place where a lot of American expats would stay. It was called the Palazzo Barberini. And one night she was there, and there were fireworks out over the Grand Canal. And she walked out onto the balcony, but then turned back into the room where her friends were sitting and said, "You must come out here. It's simply too beautiful to miss." And her artist friend, Anders Zorn, said, "I'm going to paint you just like that." So he has captured her. He's captured that kind of vitality that she was known to have. Her whole body kind of looks like a flame, doesn't it? She's all lit up, and we can see like the streaks of color from the fireworks beyond her, and of course this very long strand of pearls that nearly go to her knees, giving us a sense of just how wealthy this woman was. But this portrait from 1894, painted by Anders Zorn, really seems to capture who she was. So as she and her husband are doing all of this traveling, they're also collecting, and they begin to fill up that Beacon Street brownstone. These are images of their home, that show that it is filled with art treasures and decorative arts and furniture. It's taking over. In fact, they actually had to buy the brownstone right next to them because their collection was growing just so big. It's a little bit hard to see, but this is her Vermeer right here. This is her Rembrandt, that really made her or helped her to decide this is a museum worthy collection that she was building. And it was worth building a museum to house it all. So she and her husband began to sort of think about building a museum, for the city of Boston, for the world. And they imagined that they could tear down these two brownstones that they have and then build a museum right there on Beacon Street. They even began talking to an architect about it. But then, tragically, her husband, who we can see here in the only portrait of him that's in her museum, her husband passed away very unexpectedly at the end of 1898. So they had had many decades together, so many adventures, and he was her partner in so much of life, and he was gone. And we know that grief paralyzed her when she lost her son, but it seems as though she was determined to have a different outcome, with the loss of her husband. And within a few short weeks, she had hired an architect and she had bought a new piece of land out in the Fenway in Boston. So let's turn our attention there to Fenway Court and the building of this museum. So she decides against tearing down her Beacon Street brownstones. She's going to build new. and it was out in the middle of nowhere at the time. This is her photo, and you can just barely see the Boston city skyline in the distance. This is all marshland, essentially, and of course, it's called the Fenway. That is the marshland that is this area. That's why Fenway Park is called Fenway Park. It's known for the Fens, right? And when she built out here, the Museum of Fine Arts wasn't out here. There was nothing out there. The Museum of Fine Arts was still in Copley Square, just perpendicular to where the Boston Public Library is, the main branch. And at that point, the Museum of Fine Arts was still doing things like collecting plaster replicas of famous works from antiquity. So they weren't doing sort of the high level collecting that you might assume that they might have been doing at that time. So here's Isabella Stewart Gardner with this incredible collection of real art from Europe. And she's doing something novel here in a whole new part of town. So she's building on marshland, and it's actually kind of perfect because it allows her to build a Venetian palace the same way they build palaces in Venice. Venice is all marshland, right? So in order to actually build on that squishy ground, you have to drive pilings, which are essentially like tree trunks or telephone poles, straight into the ground, hundreds of them. And then you build your foundation on top of those pilings that are kind of floating there. So what we're looking at here on the left is a watercolor sketch of the courtyard that was created by her architect. And I want to draw your attention to the fact that on every floor of this museum, we can see um, all of these different balconies, balustrades, and windows. Some of them sort of coordinate, like this one has an OG arch that matches this one, but a lot of them are from different buildings. And these are things that she literally bought off of palaces in Venice and then shipped back to the United States. And she knew she didn't have like a complete set, but she knew that she had enough to make for like interesting windows here in her museum. You might be thinking, how did she get this all back to America? Well, her husband's family's wealth actually came from shipping. So I think they had a few good connections that way. Over here on the right is a photograph of her architect. His name was Willard T. Sears. He is on the grounds of the museum during construction here. He actually ended up winning a gold medal for this building. And when he accepted that award, he said, Isabella Stewart Gardner was actually the architect to this building. I was merely the structural engineer. So again, let that sink in. This woman who was born in 1840 designed this building. She collected this collection. So let's get to know her a little bit better. Actually, we're going to see her in a photograph here. It's a little hard to see, but this is Isabella Stewart Gardner, who is climbing a ladder here. She's probably close to 60 years old. She was there. She was giving her input on site during construction. Apparently, she only hired Italian workmen to help with the construction of this building because there was a lot of interest in it from the city of Boston, and she didn't want any of her construction workers blabbing to the press about what she was doing. So when all was said and done, here is her Venetian palazzo sitting in the Fenway in Boston all by itself. And this was really intentional. One of the problems that she ran into with her collection back in her brownstone was that it was very difficult to illuminate with electric light. It was kind of confounding her. How do you use a lamp to properly light one of these pictures? And in the end, she decided, I'm just going to illuminate them the way they were illuminated when they were first made. You know, she has all these works from the Renaissance and the Baroque, and those works were just illuminated by natural light. So her galleries, she has 3 floors of galleries here, and there was originally no electric light in those galleries. They were all just illuminated by natural light. And what you'll find is that many of her favorite works are the ones that are closest to the windows. Now, there is a 4th story to this building. And oh, and I should mention too, Part of the reason why she built out in the middle of nowhere was that there wouldn't be any other buildings that would obstruct the light. So anything that's next to a window will have pretty good light throughout the day. That was part of the goal there. Now, here in this postcard, we can see the title Mrs. Jack Gardner's Palace in Boston. So it wasn't just a museum because she actually did have living quarters on the top floor of this building. This was her apartment. She didn't live there full time. Her family also had property way out in Brookline, Massachusetts, just a couple of miles away. And that was much more expansive property. So she kind of spent time in both areas. Now we can see from this image here that, well, like I said, she had this apartment, and I should mention too that her apartment had all the luxuries. It had a telephone, it had electricity, it had an elevator too. So the museum itself was the part that didn't have those modern features. Now, I think this is a good point at which to tell you a little bit about Mrs. Gardner's will because she took, several years to build this museum. And then she took about a year and a half to install her entire collection just the way she wanted it. And she was so set on that installation remaining permanent that she wrote in her will that nothing in the museum could ever be moved, changed, bought, or sold. Otherwise, the entire collection would be dismantled, shipped to Paris, auctioned off, and all the money would go to Harvard. So it is just as she left it when she opened the museum back in 1903. Pretty extraordinary. Again, another sort of feather in her cap for being a fierce female, wouldn't you say? Now, all of this remains true to this day. It's just as she left it, but she made one huge change during her lifetime, about a decade after she opened the museum. And it actually relates to this space that we're looking at here, which almost looks like an addition to the museum, but it was always a part of the museum. What we're looking at here is a two-story concert hall. I'll take you inside. So here well, I should start off by saying that Isabella Stewart Gardner loved music almost as much as she loved art. And so she was often hosting musicians and singers in her galleries to use the space as sort of like a studio to experiment, to grow, to learn, and to make music for her guests. Now, when she opened her museum back in 1903, the first thing she did was invite her guests into this two-story concert hall, and they sat through a concert by members of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. And I'm sure they were all enjoying the concert, but really itching to see inside this museum that she had constructed. But before they could go in there, they actually had to go to the back of this two-story concert hall, proceed up these stairs to where Isabella Stewart Gardner was kind of like presiding over the whole affair. She was sitting at the top of those stairs wearing a special pair of antennae on her head that had huge, like 1 carat diamonds at the ends of them. So once they walked up those stairs and said, "Thank you for the invitation here today," they could go down these stairs, and then and only then could they head into the museum itself. So we sort of get a sense for her flair for the theatrical and her understanding of how you build anticipation around something, right? So she loved this space, she loved this music, but she did a massive overhaul of this space and it is gone now. And she made this change all because really of one object. It's this object. It's in the Spanish cloister now. I'm sure if you've been to the museum before, you've seen it and it stopped you in your tracks. It's a stunning picture by John Singer Sargent, painted when he was just 24 years old. And Isabella Stewart Gardner got rid of her two-story concert hall for this painting that she did not own. It belonged to a distant relative of her husband's. He was traveling and she said, "I'll keep it safe for you." And when he came back from his travels, her concert hall was gone. She's designed everything around this picture. And he sort of said, like, "I get it. You like it. You can keep it." So we can see as we're approaching this dramatic work of art that she has added what almost looks like a theatrical arch around this picture. It seems like a stage setting. It's kind of inviting us to get a little bit closer and explore it. So let's do just that. If you remember my John Singer Sargent program, we've spent some time with this picture before. It is called El Jaleo from 1882, an early masterwork by John Singer Sargent. He painted this work shortly after visiting Spain. And there's a lot of influence here from Spanish artists that came before him, like Diego Velázquez, who would use these inky blacks in order to create a picture. And what a picture! We can see this dramatic dancer whose body is tilted at this dramatic diagonal. Her back is sort of convex here. Her arms are kind of pulled in across her chest. Her elbows are kind of bent outwards. It's such an unusual and striking pose. It draws you in. The lighting here enhances it too. She's sort of uplit in this moment, casting this dark shadow behind her. And so we just see these kind of milky white arms here. And we take a moment to sort of understand what position her body is actually in. Behind her is this row of figures, male and female, making music, celebrating this dancer in this moment. So when I gave tours at the Gardner Museum, we would always say, this is the loudest painting in Boston. What are some of the things your eyes tell your ears to hear? And so inevitably, people would see things like, the man clapping, the men playing guitar, this figure here, who some people always thought was sleeping, but he's actually our singer. And then we get to this dancer. We can imagine the stomping of those heels. We can imagine the castanets in her hands. There's so much sound. This wonderful sense of the celebratory environment. Now, I mentioned Sargent had just been to Spain and was inspired by the Spanish art that he saw there. One of the other things that he saw in Spain was a cave where prehistoric man had painted on the walls. And Sargent gives us a little souvenir of that experience here in El Jaleo. So notice back here on the wall behind these musicians, I'll zoom in. He painted a red bull and a red handprint here. It's kind of wild, right? It's really unexpected, but it's a reference to the things that he saw painted inside that cave. He continues to use this red paint to add these little details on the back wall of this picture. We go to the other side of the image. Over the heads of the women over here, we can see in that same red paint, he's written a word again and again. Olé, olé, olé. So we can imagine that all of these women are calling out and celebrating this dancer who's standing there before her. So before them, I should say. So in addition to the clapping, the stomping, the guitars, the castanet, and the singing, we can imagine everybody screaming out these olays in this scene. It's just so fun. And I should mention too that I give Sargent a lot of credit because I'm not familiar with many other artists who are working at this time who are using text in their pictures in such a modern way. So we've got this great image here that welcomes people into the museum. Isabella Stewart Gardner built this whole section of her museum around it. We're so lucky that she did. She also installed it in a really unusual way. I've never seen anything like this before in a museum. She put a mirror alongside the painting so that when you're standing in front of the picture, this is off to the side, but when you glance at it, it creates the illusion that this picture is actually on both of those walls, that it's a three-dimensional space that you could walk right into. And I'm sure Isabella Stewart Gardner fantasized about dancing along that floor just the same way this dancer is too. Notice too that she's added these elements of these decorative arts elements that sort of suggest that same environment that we see in the painting. They're all vaguely Spanish or Islamic influenced objects. So we get a real sense in terms of how she worked as an installation artist. It's fanciful, it's based on aesthetics, it leaves you guessing a lot of the times. So this big change that she made to her concert hall for El Jaleo, there is one other element to it that I wanted to share with you. At the far end of that same room, in a space that she called the Spanish Chapel, we can see there's a marble carved knight sort of laid to rest on the floor there. And there is behind what looks like a religious altar, an image of the Madonna and Child. We can see it in full over here on the right. This is by a member of the School of Zurbaran. It's a Spanish painting. We don't know exactly who painted it, but we do know that Isabella Stewart Gardner bought the picture and loved the picture because this image of the Christ child reminded her so much of her own son. So we have this sense that that the loss of her child, even decades later, was something that she carried with her, and we will see it punctuates the whole museum experience. So we're going to go into the museum proper and experience some of the treasures, great and small. We're going to spend a little bit of time in that courtyard because there's really nothing else like it. On a rainy day in Boston, on a snowy day in Boston, it's always spring in this courtyard. It's just gorgeous. It was apparently the largest enclosed atrium, or maybe one of the largest enclosed glass atriums in the country when it was built. And so inside you have these plants and flowers always blooming, this wonderful sense of greenery and connectedness to nature. And when I worked there, I always thought, being a curator there might be a little bit boring. You can't move the objects around. There aren't really any labels on anything. But being the chief horticulturalist at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum would be a very sweet gig. And if you've never been there in April, well, then you are missing out. And you still have a few days to correct this because every year in April, the museum brings out these like 20-foot long nasturtium flowers, these vines that it takes almost a year to grow. And it is this bright pop of orange. It takes like 5 people to carry them. They weigh like 50 pounds, and they hang them over the third floor balconies, and they kind of dangle down into the courtyard, providing this kind of beautiful veil through which to look, but also this beautiful pop of color. I just learned too that nasturtiums are apparently edible. So if you're feeling very daring, you can always pop one off and see how it tastes. Uh, so Isabella Stewart Gardner started this tradition during her lifetime to sort of celebrate spring and the Easter season. This is a tradition that's kept up today because Isabella Stewart Gardner was born in April, and it's a great way to celebrate her. So staying in the courtyard just for a moment, I want to draw your attention to that pink color on the walls. It's sort of this bottled kind of effect. And apparently Isabella Stewart Gardner herself got up on a ladder again one day to show her Italian workmen exactly how she wanted this pink paint on her walls. She was thinking of the effect of light shining off of the waters of the Grand Canal in Venice and shimmering on the side of a building. And so that was what she was aiming for on the interior of her courtyard. Now, when you go to the museum, the bulk of her collection is Gothic, it's Renaissance. There's a little bit of Baroque in there too, and you are clued into that in the courtyard by those architectural elements that we saw, those windows, those balconies, the balustrades. These are called OG arches. These are Gothic arches that we see here. On the ground floor of the museum, you don't see any of those Gothic elements. Instead, you see rounded Roman arches that remind us of the ancient world, ancient Greece, ancient Rome. And supporting those arches, you'll see, are a real mix of columns. Sometimes there's double columns, sometimes there's blue columns. And it reminds us that all of these things in her collection are just things that she came across in her travels and purchased and sent home for herself. And she's assembled them in such a wonderful way. Here in the courtyard, everything reflects the ancient world. So there's a lot of classical statuary here and other objects that we'll be looking at a little bit more in depth. So it provides the literal foundation for what you're going to see upstairs. And she's so smart in how she assembled it. This is that same view, just from a different angle. We can see here that we have two elements that kind of look like obelisks here. They don't match, they don't go together, right? But she has this wonderful sense in terms of how to place them in her collection so that they are still presenting, well, it's still a harmonious display, right? Everything is sort of coordinated in this wonderful way. If we zoom out just a little bit, we can see at the center of the museum is this ancient Roman mosaic. It dates to the first few centuries of the first millennium. And if we get a little bit closer to it, we can see all of those little pieces of glass and stone. At the center of this mosaic is a face. And if we get a little bit closer still, this face has snakes for hair. And you all remember what happens to you, right? If Medusa looks at you, you turn to stone. So that's sort of like her joke in the courtyard is that she's got Medusa here at the center, and all of these classical elements have turned to stone. Why else might she want Medusa in as the center of her museum? Well, Medusa was powerful, and even more importantly, Medusa was an enchantress, and so was Isabella Stewart Gardner. She was somebody who didn't really fit the mold in Boston. She was kind of shut out of the sewing circles when she first arrived in town. And so she built a social life for herself that was really outside of the norm. It included oftentimes young men who just kind of followed her around, many, many admirers. She would do outlandish things like go to the Boston Public Zoo and take the little lion cubs for a carriage ride. She went to the Boston Symphony Orchestra wearing a big hat with a banner on it that said, "Oh, you Red Sox." She was completely outside of the norm. And because of that, she enchanted a lot of people. Now, there's another element here right beside that mosaic. We'll look at it from a different angle here. It is a little fragment of a throne from ancient Rome. And apparently, Isabella Stewart Gardner would sit there quite a bit. She liked to think of herself as descendant from the royal Stuarts of Scotland. Apparently, there is no evidence to support this, but she fancied herself as a kind of queen. And let's face it, in a certain sense, she was. She did build herself a palace, and she had all of these supporters and sort of acolytes, right? I love the improvised footstool here, the two column capitals back to back. Now, there's one last element in the courtyard that I think really speaks to who Isabella Stewart Gardner was, and it's right here, front and center. It is a child sarcophagus, a stone coffin from classical antiquity. And of course, that is the reminder that Isabella Stewart Gardner was the mother who lost her baby. So we have right here at the center the enchantress, the queen, and the mother. And these aspects of her personality, I think, infiltrate the entire collection and the way it's displayed. We're going to head upstairs right now, but before we leave the courtyard, and oh, isn't this image of the courtyard just the most breathtaking view? Wouldn't you just love to spend an afternoon sitting and reading there? As we leave the courtyard, there's one last sarcophagus that I wanted to draw your attention to. It's sort of at the edge of the courtyard before you head upstairs. It's an adult size sarcophagus. It's a magnificent example of sculpture from the ancient world. It's known as the Farnese sarcophagus, and it is It's decorated with all of these figures, human and satyrs. Their bodies are all kind of twisting together towards each other. Sometimes their limbs are sort of interlocking, and almost all of them are reaching for these bundles of grapes. So this was a sarcophagus for someone who was a part of the cult of Dionysus. Essentially, they worshipped the god of wine. And so the sarcophagus for them essentially imagines the afterlife as one big cocktail party. And we should all be so lucky. You can imagine Isabella Stewart Gardner loved this, and it kind of sets the tone for us going upstairs. Now, when you visit her museum, you kind of wind through the whole space kind of organically from one gallery to the next. We're going to skip that. We're going to go all the way to the top and start in her Gothic room. This is a room that's filled with art from the 1300s to 1400s, and an image of her. So we're going to get started with that image of her, which is over here in the corner as we enter the room. We'll get a little bit closer. We can see there's a lot of, well, there's stained glass, there's images of the Madonna and Child. And then there's Isabella Stewart Gardner. And it's a full length portrait of her. And she's positioned it behind this big wooden chest with a giant book on it. It very much looks like an altar, and this very much looks like a religious work of art. And here it is in a very religious setting, right, where everything else is a nod, or is were objects created for worship and devotion. So let's explore this picture a little bit more in depth. It might already look familiar to you because it was painted by John Singer Sargent, same artist who painted El Jaleo downstairs. And he was kind of fresh off a huge scandal in Europe where he painted a full length image of a woman wearing a black dress that caused a sensation, caused an actual scandal back in 1884, because he had painted this woman's strap of her dress kind of falling over her shoulder. It was considered in poor taste. It was considered too overtly sensual. He eventually had to repaint the strap of her dress on top of her shoulder. But this was just the kind of scandal that Isabella Stewart Gardner was quite intrigued by. So it's no accident that her portrait that came 4 years later looks an awful lot like John Singer Sargent's Madame X here. And if you had any doubt in the connection, years later, Isabella Stewart Gardner would actually collect another painting by John Singer Sargent featuring this same woman here. We can see she's giving a toast in this image in the middle. So let's zero in on Sargent's depiction of Isabella Stewart Gardner here. It's a really unusual painting. We can see that she's facing frontal. There's really nothing to sort of soften the strict frontality of this image. Many of Sargent's portraits are, figures placed at kind of a graceful three-quarter pose, kind of languishing in some way, but she's standing upright with her arms kind of framing her body, and her hands clasped here. And there's a purpose to this. And I have to believe that the purpose to this pose is all about accentuating a tiny little waist. She is almost 50 years old here, and her waist looks about 12 inches around, doesn't it? Those beautiful white arms of hers are framing up that waist in such a wonderful way, draws attention to us. And then also the double strands of pearls. Who wears pearls around their waist? Isabella Stewart Gardner does. She also has pearls and a ruby at her throat, and then two glowing rubies on her shoes as well. So for the time, this was definitely considered an ostentatious display of wealth, which was considered in very bad form in Boston. Apparently, women back then used to buy their Worth ball gowns in Paris and bring them back to Boston and let them age in like a chest for a couple of years before you take them out. You didn't want to show off your wealth in this way. But Isabella Stewart Gardner is putting it all on display, literally. Along with her gorgeous skin here. So I mentioned before that she oftentimes had young male admirers kind of trailing around behind her as she made her way through life. Around the time that this uh, portrait was painted, there was a young man named Marion Crawford that she was spending a lot of time with and rumored to be having more than a friendship with. So when this painting was unveiled in Boston, people started to say things like, this dress goes all the way down to Crawford's notch. This is just the sort of thing that made her husband so upset. And we'll talk a little bit about his reaction in just a moment. But I also want to mention what's happening in the background here, because Sargent actually used a little fragment of a tapestry that's in Isabella Stewart Gardner's collection. Now, she owned many tapestries, many exceptional tapestries, but this is just a tiny little piece of a tapestry. We can see present day, it's very much been bleached out from the sun, but it still has these forms which almost look like wings coming off of her back, and certainly looks like a halo around her head, maybe even with a little crown on top of it. So I should say too, Isabella Stewart Gardner was nearly 50 years old when this was painted. She apparently hated to have her photograph taken, but was very amenable to having her portrait done. And we sort of get the sense that it was her face that she kept going back to Sargent about. I remember hearing, and I'm not sure if it's true or not, but I will repeat it because it's a good story, that apparently she had him repaint her face here something like 11 times. So in the end, she still looks fresh as a daisy in this portrait by Sargent. So when the folks in Boston saw this, like I said, they were sort of scandalized by the skin. They also sort of said, in response to this background, who does she think she is? Some sort of Byzantine Madonna, and she didn't have the reputation of being a saint in Boston. So ultimately, her husband said, "This is just too embarrassing. Please don't exhibit this painting publicly again." For the rest of my life. And she actually abided by that. She actually went beyond that and didn't exhibit the painting publicly again for the rest of her life. So it wasn't until 1924 that you could actually set foot in the Gothic room in her museum. Now, she did open up this space to her friends and to artists and singers to use as like a creative studio space. This is a very blurry image of John Singer Sargent using Isabella Stewart Gardner's Gothic room as a painting studio. You can see that Gothic window in the background. Um, he is painting a portrait of Mrs. Fisk Warren here, which is in the collection of the MFA in Boston. So here it is, kind of, well, there it was, sort of locked away with all of these other religious objects there. If you step right outside of this room, you actually enter a chapel. This is Isabella Stewart Gardner's little chapel area. It's a very narrow space. It's essentially a hallway, but it is a gorgeous space that's marked by this French Gothic stained glass window here from Soissons Cathedral. And look at the way the sun comes through that stained glass and sort of dapples the stone floor here with all of this color. It is magnificent. It makes me wonder. It reminds me of how people back in the 1300s, back in the 1400s must have felt when they saw the color of these stained glass windows and saw them illuminated with the light of day. It would have been the most breathtaking thing you'd seen your entire life. So she not only has this window, but she made this a consecrated chapel. And according to her will, every year on her birthday, they still have to hold services for her there. I think they still do. It's such a gorgeous little space. If you head down away from the chapel, you will eventually hit this room here, this red room that's covered in this red brocade fabric. And with the furniture and the decorative arts objects and the paintings on the wall, you can see that childhood dream of hers of, creating a museum like the Pol di Pizzoli. It has come true. This is her room that's called the Titian Room. It's named for this painting here, which is said to be the most valuable work in the collection. It was done by the Italian Renaissance master named Titian. Isabella Stewart Gardner was the first person to bring a Titian, a real Titian, to the United States. She did that before she had built her museum. So this was in her Beacon Street brownstone. And she wrote to a friend, I am drunk off of Europa. I just had a 3-day orgy in front of Europa. Every single brushstroke brings pleasure. Imagine appreciating a painting to that degree. It really is just amazing. So let's kind of delve into Titian's beautiful painting here from 1562 to try and appreciate it to the same degree that Isabella Stewart Gardner did. Now, Titian, I will just say, he's working in a different part of Italy than, say, Michelangelo and Raphael, and he is known for these rather sensual works. He oftentimes places women in these kind of ungainly poses that seem to kind of expose them. And notice this lovely lady on the back of this bull here, her legs are splayed open. We can see her inner thigh almost all the way up there, and even her breasts are exposed. So this is a pretty sensual picture. It's a really compelling story here because it is the story of Europa and Zeus, the king of the gods. Europa is a mortal woman. So if you know your mythology, Zeus was, as the king of the gods, always kind of running off on his wife and getting with mortal women. He would always get caught and he would always get into trouble. So he would transform himself. One time he was a swan. This time he makes himself a bull and he seduces Europa as a bull. So the story starts off over here on the shoreline where Europa and her friends had been standing among all of these cattle. And Zeus comes in, transformed as a bull, and he goes to Europa and he's being very sweet to her. He places a crown of flowers on, she places a crown of flowers on his head. Notice just the sensuality of the bull's hair here too. I mean, it just looks as smooth as silk, doesn't it? Or as smooth as velvet. It's gorgeous. So Zeus kind of starts flirting with Europa as a bull. He kind of kneels down, she hops on his back, and he takes off with her. So Titian has painted the scene in the story where everything changes. And we don't really know how things are going to end up for Europa here. There are these dark clouds coming in. Her friends are waving a scarf to her. She's waving a red scarf back to them. And if we think of our associations with the color red, it's like danger, it's like stop, it's also passion. So because of Titian's reputation as this painter of very sensual images, we can surmise that Europa's looking back at her friends. She might also be rolling her eyes back in her head in ecstasy. This could be the consummation of their love if you wanted to think of it that way. And you wouldn't be that far off because there are Cupid flying around and riding fish all around them. So this is a love story. So what ends up happening is that Zeus and Europa fly across the continent of Europe. It's named for her, and they settle on the island of Crete, give birth to a long line of kings. It's a painting about the birth of Western civilization, but it was considered so naughty for the time, right? That it was almost shocking to people when it was painted. And Isabella Stewart Gardner loved this picture so much, she had a really unusual installation for it. She actually took one of her Worth ball gowns and sort of dismantled it and put it on the wall underneath the painting. So this is her ball gown right here. And it's kind of like a almost like a sage green color. But we think that the tassel pattern on the dress sort of reminded her of the shape of the bull's tail. Everything else that she's assembled on these tables is reminiscent of a form that you see in the picture. Probably most clearly, we can see that there is a cupid here, a bronze cupid that she puts on its side, even though it's supposed to be upright, but on its side, it sort of recalls the shapes and the forms that you see up above. So this gives you a sense in terms of her insight into how she would display her collection. In the next room, it's the Veronese room, and it's a room that is covered in these gilt leather panels. They're embossed too. They've got a texture to it. We think of like a leather jacket as a significant expense. Imagine doing a whole room in leather. So it's a room that's filled with all of these little exquisite objects for our time and our purposes. I'm just going to zero in on these 4 little pastels here. These are from the American expatriate artist James Abbott McNeill Whistler. And this image here is actually a portrait of Isabella Stewart Gardner. They became friends. Notice that it is right along this portrait of a reclining female nude. And so we know Isabella Stewart Gardner posed for this one. And people who came to her museum rightfully thought, well, did she pose for this one over here? You can imagine if, like, the strap of a dress falling off caused a scandal. This caused a little scandal in its own right, too. But apparently, Isabella Stewart Gardner just liked letting people wonder about that. So we head out of the Vernese room downstairs to the Dutch room, which is covered in this kind of like green silk fabric here. I believe all of the fabric walls have had to have replicas made because everything is so light sensitive. Everything's been on display for more than 100 years. And when we see this photo, of course, the Dutch room was hardest hit with the art heist, which we will be getting to. But this room does have one of my favorite objects in the collection, and that is her Rembrandt self-portrait. You'll remember that this is the painting that got her thinking, I should really start a museum. And thank God she did, because this painting is magnificent in every way. Rembrandt was living in the 1600s, and he was only 23 years old when he painted this picture. He was a struggling young artist trying to prove himself, and there's probably no way that he actually dressed like this. He was poor, right? So we can think of this as a painting of him playing dress up, him trying to prove to potential wealthy clients that he could paint all of the wonderful things that they own. There's some wonderfully Baroque things about this painting, namely that it has this strong diagonal organizing it, sort of from the edge of his body here, leading our eye all the way up to the tip of that feather. And we can also see that there's strong light over here, almost like a beam of light being shot at the side of his face and at his shoulder. The rest of it is in this dark shadow. So strong diagonal, dramatic light. This is very Baroque. Let's go back to how he's presenting himself here and consider the textures. This is a picture all about textures. Imagine running your hand down that feather. How would that feel? Imagine the contrast of feelings when you get to this silky cap on top of his head. And then another remarkable contrast, this furball head of hair that he's got here. You could almost imagine losing your fingers in that. And then a very soft, smooth cheek that brings you down to a little bit of peach fuzz on his chin. And just below his chin is this scarf. I'm going to zoom in for you here because the scarf actually has gold thread in it. It is breathtaking to see in person. You zoom out a little bit here, we can see the cloak that he's wearing is this fabulous green. And we know just by looking at it what that material is. It's velvet. How do you paint velvet? And how do you do it when you're 23 years old, right? And you're poor and struggling. And that's offset by this beautiful gold chain that he's wearing. It is just an outstanding painting. That light that shines on his cheek here, it sets his eyes back into shadow. It forces us to peer just a little bit more closely to who he is, to surmise, like, what is this young man thinking and feeling? Well, he is looking out onto the Dutch room, and this is what the Dutch room looks like from his perspective. And I can share with you a fun story here. There's these two tables. Isabella Stewart Gardner did not think of her museum space as her home, but she would oftentimes entertain in these spaces, in this room in particular. So sometimes the Gardner Museum would like set up her holiday display here. They put out all of her china and set out the recipe that she would have prepared for her holiday meals. But the story that I like best is that apparently when Harvard football team beat Yale, she would have the whole team over for dinner in this room, which seems like a real good perk to being on the football team, but a great perk for her too. And we can now see why she attracted the attention of so many young men. So as we leave this room, we'll get back to the empty frames in a moment. We head through her tapestry gallery, which is really the second floor where that two-story concert hall was. It's an enormous space with two cycles of Flemish tapestries here from the Renaissance lining the walls. It feels like an early Northern Renaissance castle. It is it's kind of dark and it's like this wonderfully moody space. We're going to move right through here because the tapestries are dense in terms of their imaging. We could spend weeks just talking about them. So here we've entered this little antechamber from the tapestry room. And in this antechamber that's called the short room, that's where her portrait all lit up like a flame is. That's where the only portrait of her husband is. But there are also these cases where she kept works on paper. And she had drawings by Raphael, by Michelangelo, by many of the like old masters of the Italian Renaissance. And right next to it here is a Napoleonic flag. One of the things stolen back in 1991 during that heist was the finial, sort of the top part of that Napoleonic flag. Imagine being a thief and going for the flag when the Michelangelos were just a couple feet away. There's so much about that heist that's just perplexing. We wind up in another red covered room. This is her Raphael room. It's actually right underneath the Titian room. And she called it Raphael because she does have several Raphaels. Her entire life, she was hoping to collect an example of Raphael's paintings of the Madonna and Child. She never actually got one. This room is kind of filled with images that look a lot like Raphael's Madonna and Child. She ended up getting these two works here, and because they are her favorites in this room, they are situated right next to the window. So we'll get a little bit closer. This first Raphael is painted in 1510. It's a portrait of a man named Count Tommaso Ingrahimini. And every time I look at it, I am reminded that Raphael was like a social butterfly. He was somebody who really understood people and could get along with people. Because if any of us were charged with painting a portrait of a very plump man who had strabismus in one eye, we'd probably be a little bit stumped in terms of how to flatter him. But Raphael figures it out. He puts a desk in front of that giant body. He puts a rope around a non existent waist. And then he has Count Tommaso not looking out at us, which would have a jarring effect, but up and off to the side as he's writing here, making it look like he's deep in thought, that he's reflecting, or maybe even with the window right alongside it with light pouring in, that he's receiving divine inspiration. And that would be so appropriate because Count Tommaso was actually the librarian to the Vatican and a very well loved and funny figure. So Raphael did a great job of flattering him. You can see um, Isabella Stewart Gardner sort of carrying on that tradition by putting him right next to the window. Right in front of Count Tommaso is another much smaller Raphael. It's an image of the Lamentation or the Pietà, the dead Christ in his mother's arms. She mounted this to a desk so she could sit right in front of it and contemplate that theme, which of course hit home for her. So one last image from that theme that I wanted to share with you is Isabella Stewart Gardner's Fra Angelico from her early Italian room, which is right next door. This is a painting that is very easy to miss at the museum. It's kind of hidden behind the edge of, well, it's hidden in this little nook, but it is right next to a window. It's an example of early Italian Renaissance painting. There's a lot of gold in it still. It still kind of looks sort of Gothic. Um, it's a painting of the Dormition and Assumption of the Virgin. And if you're familiar with your Catholic liturgy, the idea here is that when Mary, the mother of Jesus, died, that she did not leave a corpse behind in this world, that her body was fully assumed up into heaven. She becomes the queen of heaven. So Fra Angelico breaks this story up into two pieces. First, she's passed away. She's swathed in drapery here. She's being mourned by Christ's followers. And then, much more importantly, she's in this golden heavenly realm. She has entered heaven. She's risen up above. She's in this gorgeous kind of white pale blue gown. She's being celebrated by the angels who are making music. I love how her hands are up in like this position that's sort of part prayer, part celebration. And I think most importantly, we can see her son Jesus just above her with his arms wide open, ready to receive his mother. And you can bet Isabella Stewart Gardner must have thought a lot about that reunion with her son as well. So, before we finish up, we'll just do a quick recap of the big, well, the biggest art heist in history. It is the biggest art heist in history, but it is not the biggest in terms of number of objects stolen. There have been bigger art heists that way. This is the biggest in terms of the value of the objects stolen. So I'm sure most of you remember this. It's oftentimes repeated, even by me, and it's a 35-year-old story now. 35 years ago, last month, two men who were wearing Boston police uniforms went to the back door of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum late into the morning, following the evening of St. Patrick's Day, when there's a lot of partying happening in Boston. The police are pulled in a lot of different directions. They showed up at the museum saying that they had gotten a call for a disturbance. They rounded up the two men who were working there as guards that night, and they duct taped their hands, their faces, their feet. They handcuffed them to pipes in the basement. And then these two men spent about 75 minutes going through the galleries, finding exactly what they were going to steal. This is, as you can see from our gallery shots that I've shared, these are densely packed galleries. Isabella Stewart Gardner owned 7,500 paintings alone. That doesn't even account for the decorative arts or the furniture. There is so much there. So they spent their time. And for that reason, I always imagine that it was sort of like a gentleman's crime, sort of like Thomas Crown affair. Like they were art appreciators and they were having their museum experience. And then they just kind of had to take something with them, a souvenir. But in the end, it was not that at all. It was a smash and grab. These empty frames here are empty because they were taken off the walls. The objects were cut out of their frames in some cases. And here, these are crime scene photos that I'm sharing with you. We can even see that some of the glass was broken in order to get these paintings out. They're let's see, the object in this room that is considered to be the most valuable was right here, mounted to this desk, a small painting by one of Rembrandt's contemporaries, an artist named Vermeer, who famously only painted about 35 paintings his entire life. One of them was at the Gardner, so this is considered the most valuable work stolen. Incidentally, Isabella Stewart Gardner outbid the Louvre Museum for this work when she bought it at auction. So she clearly really loved it too. This is called The Concert, and it's a great example of Vermeer's paintings. He's known for these sweet little interior scenes. These are all probably scenes from his own home. They're arranged in a similar format where light pours in from the left-hand side. We get these delicate details of everyday life. I love a good table carpet and the tiled floor, the stringed instruments. And we can see here that we've got three figures who are making music: a standing singer, a seated male man who's playing a stringed instrument. We see him from behind, and then another woman who's seated in profile at a harpsichord. Now, one of the things that I've always found so fascinating about Dutch art from this time period is like you have this sense of exploration and kind of like world domination with the Dutch East India Company. This was a culture that was really set on understanding the land, the landscape, how to get around the world. So it's not unusual for artists from this time to include landscapes or maps as decorations inside their paintings. So we have several paintings within the painting here. One of them is a landscape. We can see another landscape painted inside the harpsichord over here. I love how this man's head sort of punctuates that beautifully. And then we have a painting that actually belonged to Vermeer's mother-in-law, And it's an image of a madam with a courtesan and a John here. So sort of flirtatious, erotic overtones. And then we have another threesome right in front of it. And you have to imagine that Vermeer intended for some sort of correlation between the painting within the painting and the three figures that we see here. We don't know if there's a love triangle at play, but at the very least, because they're making music together, there is this sense that they are in accord with one another, which is such a lovely thought, right? So we proceed on from here. I'm just going to show you this one Rembrandt painting that was stolen. There were 13 works stolen altogether, several Rembrandts. Rembrandts are like, Rembrandt is the second most stolen artist of all time. Tends to be pretty easy to steal his works because they tend to be smaller in size, and he's considered, old master status. This is his very Baroque picture of Christ on the Sea of Galilee here. It's cut in half diagonally by the mast of this ship that is being tossed in the storm. We have the light breaking through the clouds on one side. We have this very dangerous dark sky over here on the other side. I just love the detail of the waves and this ship sort of climbing that huge wave over here. But the elements of this picture that I love the most are probably the most relatable too. The fact that Rembrandt puts himself in this picture. This is not the first time or the only time that he paints himself right alongside Jesus. What a bold thing to do, right? But here he's on the boat right near Jesus, and he's looking out at us. He's inviting us in to this crazy scene that he has created. And just to emphasize how sort of perilous these seas are. We even have somebody who's getting sick over the side of the boat here. It's just wonderful, very human details. I love this painting. I would give anything to see it in person. Um, Isabella Stewart Gardner actually had two Rembrandt self-portraits in her collection. One of them we saw, the other one was a tiny little etching, and we always say it's about the size of a postage stamp. It's about an inch and a half tall. It was in a frame that was screwed into a piece of furniture. And the thieves that night took the time to unscrew that frame and take it out and take the etching out of its frame and to make off with that object. You can imagine it probably took them a long time to realize it was the tiny Rembrandt that was missing. And you might be thinking, why didn't they take that glorious one that we looked at? Why is that great one still there? Thank God it is. Apparently, they considered it. They took this Rembrandt, the self-portrait from age 23, off the walls. They thought about taking it with them, but it's painted on a wooden panel. It's not something that they could cut out of the frame and roll right up. You look much more conspicuous if you're carrying something like this down the sidewalk. So they decided to leave it. And of course, all of those frames remain empty, in part because of Isabella Stewart Gardner's will, but also it's like not giving up on the fact that we hope one day they will be returned. You don't put up a facsimile of what was there because the authenticity of the original object mattered so much to Isabella Stewart Gardner. It's not like, how the MFA used to collect those plaster casts and put them up in place of the original. We hope, we hope that those original paintings are one day restored. Hopefully we don't have to wait another 35 years for that. All right. So we'll wrap up very quickly. We've got just a couple minutes left. Our conclusion. There are a few galleries, few very small galleries on the first floor at the front of the museum. And these were spaces where Isabella Stewart Gardner invited artists to come in and work on their craft. She also worked in these spaces. This is her little desk in the McKnight Gallery, and she would fill these spaces with works by her contemporaries. So here's just another view of that same gallery, and I want to zero in on this one last work for you. This is another portrait of Isabella Stewart Gardner by John Singer Sargent. It's a watercolor, and he painted it just 2 years before she passed away. By this point, she had suffered a debilitating stroke that dramatically limited her mobility. So he has painted her kind of swathed in this white shroud. It's almost as though she's preparing for death in this picture. He set her against this kind of ivory or butter colored divan here. It's another sort of masterful painting of like white on white. There's just a lot of subtlety in it. We still get the sense that there is vitality to that face. I mean, it's the same face we saw in the portrait that he painted decades earlier. And he gives us just a little bit of a hint of this incredible life that she's led with this shadow that he's painted just beyond her, where there is the likeness of a face just hanging out behind her, giving us a sense of that person who she used to be. Now, Isabella Stewart Gardner passed away in 1924 at the age of 84. And initially, her body was laid out for viewing inside her museum in that Spanish chapel that we saw before, right in front of that picture that reminded her so much of her son. So, a reunion there, that reunion that she had been hoping for. And then ultimately, her body was laid to rest, interred in a family crypt at the Mount Auburn Cemetery just across the river in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And Mount Auburn is a garden cemetery. It's an arboretum. It's one of the most beautiful cemeteries in New England, at least. And we can see that this woman who surrounded herself with beauty and with beautiful gardens during life is just in the exact right place in death. We can only hope that her afterlife is a wonderful cocktail party like that sarcophagus that we saw. I will end tonight with the object that I always prompted people to look for as they were leaving the museum. This would have been the front of her museum. Now there's an addition on the back now, so the front isn't as quite as relevant anymore. But right there, sort of front and center, there's like this old sort of medieval crest here. And at the bottom of it, it says in French, c'est mon plaisir, which is, it is my pleasure. And collecting these objects, living amongst these objects, sharing them with people was her pleasure. What a wonderful thing that she shared them with the world. So we end tonight with the idea of Isabella Stewart Gardner, who was the enchantress, the queen, and the mother who created this life of beauty for herself that she shared with the world, and that we are so lucky that she did. So I will end there for now, and I welcome any questions or comments that you have about Isabella Stewart Gardner or that incredible museum. Thank you so much. I'll start looking at the Q&A here first. Florence says, how did they overcome her will to make the changes that they did? Florence, great questions. I think a lot of times things were fudged in order to make sure that the museum could run as a museum. So before they put on the big Renzo piano addition that is there now, they did have a little space for a shop, and they did have a little space for a cafe, but that was just so that the museum could really function. I don't think anybody was trying to. I don't think there are hawks there trying to catch people in making those small changes when they're there to support the museum itself. Hi, Donna. Thanks for being here. Joe, thank you so much for being here. Joe, you're always so good to ask about my upcoming events. Please feel free to go to my website. There's a calendar page to my website so you can see what's upcoming. But next month's talk is on flowers in art. So April showers bring May flowers. We'll see the flowers in May. Teresa says, I'm very interested in how, where both her family and her husband's family gained their wealth. Lots and lots of wealth. I'll say, Teresa, that is true. That's an understatement, right? So her family had a stake in the Irish linen trade, which probably speaks to her interest in fabrics and textiles. She was pretty savvy in that. And the Gardner family, not only were they involved in shipping, but I think they also had a stake in real estate too. So both of the families, extreme wealth. We're talking like the one percenters here for sure. Flora says the courtyard is gorgeous. Is there any way to actually go into it? Well, the courtyard, just like her beloved city of Venice, is sinking. So they keep people out of it. There aren't pilings, from what I understand, underneath the courtyard. So it has sunk some since it has been built. But I will share with you. There was a private event once at the museum. I was just in grad school, working as a museum teacher, and they wanted somebody from the museum to just welcome everybody to the museum. They set up a microphone probably on this side of the mosaic. And they said, Jane, why don't you greet everyone tonight? And I got to go into the courtyard, and it was like a shining moment of my life. It was really cool. Um, Joe says, how do they find the record? I'm not quite sure what you mean there, Joe, but if you wanted to clarify. Oh, he says, can you do a program on Van Gogh at my library? We'll have to get your library to call me. And I do have a great Van Gogh program that hopefully we could connect on. Mary says, in today's money, what was her net worth? How much did she spend on her collection? Any idea? Those are like the $1,000 questions, Mary. I haven't done those calculations, but I also don't know. I actually do have a rare talent for extrapolating from old old figures what it's worth in today's money, but I don't know offhand what her net value was. Like say when her husband passed away, or when she passed away. Needless to say, they were spending, tens of thousands of dollars on objects of art. So they were, I mean, they were easily millionaires, I would surmise. But I don't have the exact figures for you. Sorry about that. I'll have to do some digging. Karen says, was electricity added during her life? Great question. I'm not exactly sure when it was added. I think just based on how it looks in there, my hunch is that yes, it was added while she was alive, but I'm not entirely sure. I do kind of like the romantic notion of like seeing those Renaissance paintings in the kind of light that they would have been seen in when they were originally created. It's an interesting conundrum, isn't it? Someone anonymous says, didn't one of the guys die in a nursing home of Alzheimer's a few years ago? And he talked about the robbery to people because of the Alzheimer's. He was drunk and a junkie and wasn't certain what happened to what they stole. Ooh, those details, I'm not sure. If I'm remembering correctly, I do believe that one of the guards has since passed away, but I'm not sure if there was a suspect that has also passed away too. Probably. I mean, it's been so long, it's been 35 years. I wouldn't be surprised. And it's so scary to think that with like each one of these deaths, we're losing this critical information. Um, let's see, somebody else asked, married in 1860, did her husband serve in the Civil War? Probably paid somebody to go for him, if not. As I understand it, he did not. And it seems like they both kind of avoided politics in the 1860s, which was kind of interesting. There is a phenomenal, incredibly well researched biography of Isabella Stewart Gardner called Chasing Beauty. It's a great book. I highly recommend it. I'm about halfway through it, the level of research is mind-boggling, but it also gets into exactly sort of her family's politics and how kind of they kind of weathered the Civil War. And let's see, Mary says, how did they get telephone and electricity to the top floor since the museum was way out in the fens with nothing else around it, no infrastructure yet? Mary, I have no idea, but I imagine that if you have all the money in the world, you might be able to make things happen. That's my best guess, but that's a very good question. Maybe some of that came a little bit later, but I thought it was from the get-go. Let's see. I'm gonna move back in the chat just a little bit. Oh, yep. Somebody said that they were reading The Lioness of Boston, which I think is sort of like a fictionalized account of her life. Thanks for adding that in. There's another great book called Mrs. Jack. Back when I trained to become a docent or museum teacher at the Gardner, that was sort of the go-to text on Isabella Stewart Gardner's life. Um, let's see, going way back here. Somebody says nasturtiums taste like radishes. Thanks for adding that. Now I'm less interested in trying one of them. Um, Sharon says, "Will I be sending the recording?" I think it gets automatically sent. If it doesn't, the Chelmsford Public Library, this is their Zoom account, so I think they would be the place to look for it. I'm giving this presentation again next Wednesday, I believe, through the Maynard, Massachusetts Public Library as part of their Festival of Books, because they are actually featuring the author who wrote Chasing Beauty. If you wanted to look at their calendar, that would be a great thing to look into. And I'm going way back here at the beginning of the chat, answered a few of these things about the family money. My favorite thing that she collected was a cigar from Brahms. She met him. Brahms smoked the cigar, snuffed it out, and then she pilfered it. That is amazing. I didn't even know that, Sam. Thanks for sharing that. One of my favorite random things in the collection is a replica of Dante's death mask. That was always really fun. It's in one of these cases with all of these rare books, and you can just kind of pull the fabric back and come face to face with Dante. It's great. There's all sorts of strange things in the collection. The Gardners were shipping magnates. Thanks for adding that, Sam. She used her inheritance from her father to buy the art for the collection. Oh, yes. And yes, there are wonderful parallels to the Barnes collection too. But she was a woman. And if I'm remembering correctly, she did this before Barnes. I think she did it before the Frick. I mean, she was a pioneer. What year did Sargent paint the El Jaleo? That was 1882. The studies for the work are amazing. Yes. Oh, I believe many of the studies are in her collection now. You can probably find them on the museum's website, which is a fabulous, fabulous resource. Let's see here. Just going through here. Oh, somebody said, Adrian says, pretty sure all the vines are down already. What a bummer. Well, at least we got to see the pictures today. Let's see. They have poinsettias at Christmas, which is lovely. Can you speak about the wall hand-woven tapestries in the museum? I don't know too much about them offhand. I know she has two major cycles. One of them is I think maybe both of them are biblical in terms of their subject matter, and one of them features figures in sort of the contemporary dress of the people from like the 1500s. They're very complicated imagery. I think there's about 10 of them in total. I don't know much beyond that, Louise. I apologize, but I mean, they are exceptional in their own right. And again, such fragile objects that have been on display for so long. Um, Another question is, where'd she get all her money? I think we answered that. And does she still have family living in Boston? If I'm remembering correctly, she and her husband ended up raising some of his nephews, and and their descendants are still kind of connected to the museum. I'm not sure if they're still in Boston. Is the stained glass window lit by natural light? I do believe it is. And yes, and so Eve asked, did the Gardners adopt John Gardner's brother's sons? I haven't gotten to that point in the Chasing Beauty yet, in terms of, because I don't know if they officially adopted them or if they just raised them. But yes, they did raise those two boys later on. And then Courtney says, unfortunately, she needs to leave. I'm glad you can watch it again later. Somebody else asked about Brahms' cigar, and I think it was Sam who answered that one. I wasn't familiar with that story. It's fantastic. Questions about the electricity added during her life. Uh, when were all the ceiling spotlights added? Great question, Karen. I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that. How are the stained glass windows cleaned? Whew. Usually when historic places are cleaned, you don't call in a regular cleaning crew. It is actually the curators that have to do like the dusting and getting rid of cobwebs. Um, so I think that's what's at play there. Nancy Parker is here, and she wrote a very nice message. Thank you, Nancy. And I'm so glad you get to go visit the museum again, because I do think a lot of this is good background for appreciating it. Rocco says, does the light coming through the windows cause any damage to those paintings? Rocco, ding, ding, ding. Yes, this this whole museum is a huge preservation challenge. Um, in no museum really would you ever want all of your object collections out all the time. Like that little fragment of a tapestry that we saw that was used as the inspiration for her portrait by Sargent. I mean, things get bleached out by the light. They've tried to dissipate the light in every way that they could, but it's a huge threat to the collection. So if anybody here wants to go into like museum preservation or conservation or anything like that, you could probably find a job at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum eventually. And Heather says, I'd love to know who the number one stolen artist is. It's actually Picasso. It's pretty easy to fake. And he created like 10,000 works of art during his lifetime. So yeah, you could probably do a little doodle tonight, Heather, and pass it off as a Picasso if you wanted to. Jamie says the self-portrait is currently in the Jewish Museum in New York City. Well, I'm forgetting which self-portrait that might be. Oh, Rembrandt self-portrait. Oh my goodness. Terrence says, oh, I was hoping to see her Vermeer when I visit. I love that painting. Oh, Terrence, I'm so sorry to break that one to you. She was an amazing woman, wasn't she, though? And it's nice to be able to at least see reproductions of that Vermeer because it's exquisite. Thank you, everybody, for these very kind words that I'm seeing. This is always a pleasure. Jamie mentioned Chasing Beauty now. It's out in paperback. It's so worth reading. It's an amazing book. Um, very kind words, everybody. I always appreciate it. I'm going to copy and paste all of this and read it tonight with a glass of wine. Karen says, did she purchase items herself or did she have someone do it for her? She did have a young art historian named Bernard Berenson, who is, I believe, Harvard trained, who did some of the advising and some of the buying for her, particularly some very significant works. When you go through the museum, you can see that she collected a lot of like idiosyncratic things that some people wouldn't even say art is like museum worthy, but some of her bigger acquisitions, she did have advice from this young man, Berenson. And if you think about it, what did Berenson have to go off of? Berenson himself is like this fascinating figure because it's not like he could look something up on the web, and it's not like there were 1,000 catalogs and books that were written. I mean, he had a very well-trained eye, but he didn't always give her the best advice. Sometimes he would say, don't buy that. And then later on, he would say, buy it. And that at that point, it was much more expensive. So that's like a whole interesting thread to all of this too. Let's see. Lucky they had the opportunity and means to make good use of these funds. Also, did she keep track of the costs? Karen, I'm assuming she did. I don't know that much about that aspect of it. Um, let's see. Do I give lectures all the time, Deborah? Thank you for asking. I do them in person and via Zoom. I really love working with these communities that have Zoomed in tonight because we've developed quite an art loving community here online together. But if anybody's ever interested in having me, I go all over the country to do lectures like this, and it's my joy. So thank you for asking. Do I know what the last item she collected was? Rebecca, what a fascinating question. I do not know the answer to that, I'm afraid, but now I would really love to know. When did she stop collecting? Could she stop collecting? Was it a compulsion? What was she fascinated by towards the end of her life? Taryn says, when she passed away, since she was childless, did she bequeath any of her wealth to relatives? Um, I believe she kept an endowment for the museum. I'm not, and I'm assuming that she gave some money to some philanthropies as well, if I'm remembering correctly. The apartment that she kept, according to her will, could be used by subsequent museum directors, and the first two directors of the museum lived there. Then it was used for administrative space. So when I was serving as a museum teacher there, I could go up there occasionally and visit with some of the staff, which was always really fun. It definitely had a mystique to it. You can see pictures of the fourth floor online too. Uh, oh, Tom added net worth in today's money was 50 million at the time of death. Wow. Nothing to nothing to snub your nose at. Frank Cronson, thanks for being here. I always love seeing your name online. 50 million. Now I'm going to be thinking about that. Um, thank you, everybody, for these very kind words. I won't keep you much longer. I think we got to most of these questions. Robin says, I think Julia died in childbirth, and Jack's brother Joe, her husband, committed suicide. So Isabella and Jack raised the three boys. Wow. Oh, a sad story there. Robin, thank you for sharing that. And again, thank you everybody for your time, your very kind comments. It blows me away, and I love to be able to do this. And I really appreciate each one of you being here tonight. So somebody said, "What's my website?" It is. I'll put it in the chat. I am culturallycurious.com. So you can see upcoming free public programs, and if you wanted to contact me about doing a lecture, you can do that through my website too. Berenson does not come off well in many of the narratives Ron says. It feels like we could have a much longer conversation about this, but I don't want to keep people too much longer. Again, thank you, everybody. I look forward to seeing you next month with Flowers and Art. It will be so much fun. Thank you again. Take care, everybody. Have a great night.